Well, thank you. It's great to be back up here on stage. If you want to know where barbers get their haircut, where Italians eat pizza, and where a journalist who's interested and writes about energy actually goes to learn about energy and climate, you're going to see it now, because I'm here with my two literally favorite teachers on this subject, Andy Karsner and Harvey. Andy currently has his own energy company, Manifest Energy, and works, among other things, with Google X on their energy work. But Andy and I met at the Bali COP when Andy, as Assistant Secretary of Energy for Renewables for George W. Bush administration, led the American team at that COP. And Harvey runs Energy Innovations, which is doing, I think, some of the premier intellectual groundwork on this subject. Andy, I want to begin with you. You're a COP veteran. We had a lot of fun in Bali. We had less fun in Copenhagen. To what extent is this meeting different from your point of view? And as someone who represented a Republican administration in this negotiating process, what do you think is the message and the opportunity here for the Republican Party today if they want to seize it?
Yeah, Tom, the first great difference for me is I have the luxury of being here not as a partisan political official. So I get to answer very candidly those questions.
Great.
Let me try to do it with a little bit of context, a little bit of contemporary politics, what you're asking about, I think, and a little bit of history. On the context, I feel a great sense of redemption here in Paris. When we were in Bali, which I would assert the Paris Treaty is ultimately the derivative of, we were basically advocating a reversal of course on Kyoto. We were saying that we were encountering a placebo effect that was going to take us in the wrong direction, focused exclusively on wealth transfer and dividing the world irrationally in static lines between developed and non-developed world. And that we needed something different to get beyond Kyoto. And so the Bali Roadmap was devised for that purpose. We deviated away from it in Copenhagen. This is a little bit of a weakened version of Bali, but not an unimportant one. If you want to constrain the flow of something, in this case greenhouse gases, if you want to build a dam across the river, you need to go all the way. You need to put every last brick in place. And so we need this global agreement as a framework to get started, as a catalyst and a signal. I view that in some ways as a redemption for what originated as Republican ideas, for a framework process that originated itself under George H.W. Bush and was ratified by the Senate in the 90s, almost a quarter century ago. It's a perverse irony then, if we talk about contemporary politics, that as Secretary Kerry indicated this morning, former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he was a little bit ambiguous on whether they would take this for ratification. And then we've heard other clear signals saying that they won't, that this is an agreement, even though the French and Fabius begun the conference saying this is a treaty. And everybody thinks they're negotiating a treaty, but for semantics and U.S. dysfunction and convenience, this is something that may just be an agreement. And he used the key word of legitimacy. Can we get a legitimate debate? I think we have to have this debate according to the constitutional processes we have for the Senate to ratify an international accord that is clearly a treaty and a modification and an implementation of a ratified treaty. And, I would think if Democratic political strategists were focused right, they would probably think it's an opportunity because this debate, when it happens, debate and discourse and dialogue that is necessary in our nation, rather than a continuity of the polarity and the avoidance, is going to put at risk everybody under 35 for the Republican Party if the party does not skate towards a more logical position in advocating for this issue.
The party will never have a chance to reach those under 35 voters. You're saying if they don't in some way use Paris, declare victory here and use it as a bridge back, basically?
This can be a bridge back to neatly put this behind the Republican Party as an issue, and more importantly, in my opinion, to enter the competition and virtuous cycle of ideas. Duopolies don't innovate, monopolies are even worse, and in America, we need better ideas about how to implement the future we want to address challenges this large. Can I just say one more word about the history in this thing? Because of what was said by Secretary Kerry this morning and what was said by Mr. Trump yesterday. I view Mr. Trump as a counterfeit Republican. I view him clearly as a danger to the Republican brand, which he has not always held. But more than that, I view him as a cartoonish neo-fascist lout. And I think he is a
You got to tell me afterwards
Yeah.
what you really think of him.
Right. This is the luxury of not being a partisan public official. But I will tell you that it's disgraceful that these things are heard in Paris and around the world. But for a party that was founded, its founding president is Lincoln, and a colossus overlooks our mall with the words "with malice towards none and charity for all," for them who have borne the battle and their widow and their orphan, and yet we have this disgraceful behavior peddling fear in the wake of everybody claiming Ronald Reagan, who cited a city on a hill with open gates for those with the will and the heart to arrive, that they would always stay open. We have come to a very dark place, and our party needs to purge the stain of this kind of predatory instinct on ignorance and fear.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you very much, man. Thank you. Thank you. Really well said. Hal, also a veteran of this process. One of the things that in running up to the meeting, Hal and I have been talking about, and he keeps keeping me focused on one moment, and that is not what happens on Friday, but what happens the morning after the morning after. Let's assume, Hal, we get an agreement. Talk to me about what has to happen the morning after for this COP to really be meaningful.
That's exactly the question we need to focus on. One can argue Paris was a success before the conference opened because you had all these nations submitting plans about what they can do to abate carbon emissions. We could sprinkle the forum with magic dust right now and come out with a gilded document. It wouldn't make any difference at all unless when the leaders go home, they sit down and they look at their cars, their factories, their buildings, and their power plants and come up with strategies to transform them. This is the paramount challenge. And this is not politics, this is physics. It turns out that there are a small number of incredibly important policies that drive these transformations, and there's a large number of policies that are either benign or worse, destructive. And if you look at most energy policy in history, it unfortunately tends toward the latter. The US has had a lot of omnibus energy bills. They're integrated by stapler, right? And they have warring factions as you go through them. They're never scored with respect to their impact on energy. I'll just give an example. I think today the CEO of Acciona said that they signed a solar contract for under 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, last year, Japan signed solar contracts for 53 cents a kilowatt hour. And I'm here to tell you, one of those is the wrong number. And so what's the difference? The difference is great policy design versus poor policy design. Let me give an example from the US, which is quite interesting. In 1974, Gerald Ford signed a fuel efficiency standard for cars to double from 13 miles per gallon to 26. That was accomplished by 1985. We reduced by half the amount of gasoline consumed in an automobile, a new automobile. That number stayed in place with almost no changes for 25 years. And now it's being doubled again. That 25-year pause cost us over $1 trillion, most of which went to countries that don't like us very much, and in my opinion, bankrupted the American auto industry because they were not innovating on core technologies. They were working on cup holders rather than engines and transmissions. If instead President Ford had said, we're going to set it at an increase of 3% a year, continuous improvement and a long-term signal, it would have had a dramatically different effect. That one sentence would have saved that $1 trillion, would have saved our auto industry. So that's good policy design.
It was the political equivalent of assisted suicide of the American automobile industry. So to pick up on that point then, to design good policy, especially in a world where turning the right dials, just the right way, not even in that large a fashion, can make a huge difference. Talk about the tool that Energy Innovations has built to do just that, because I think everyone in this room and everyone watching will want to download this for the morning after the morning after.
Well, thanks, Tom. So we were confronted with, in many conversations with respected and determined political leaders to understand which policy will drive which outcome. Emphatically the question on the table Monday morning, right? We examined more than 50 models and found that none of them could do an adequate job with this. And so we set out to build one and put an incredible team together. And what it is a replica of the physical economy. It knows how many cars there are and how far they go and what kind of fuel mileage they get and the carbon content of their gasoline. And then it says if you tweak the fuel efficiency standard, that will, and you look year by year by year, there will be an impact. We built this for every sector of the economy, and it models 50 different policies, and it doesn't put a thumb on the scale, and it doesn't presuppose any outcome. There's no favorites. It lets the user turn any policy up and down, and in real time, CO2 emissions change.
You actually see the graph,
Yeah.
bend down or bend up.
And it shows economic impacts and other pollutants. It's and then we decided, actually our design from the beginning, the entire thing is open source. The model, the data, and it has a web interface so anyone can run it. You go to energypolicy.solutions, and you'll be able to see this thing in action, and you'll be able to play with it and come up with a scenario. We've had some pretty great results from running it, too.
Hal, talk just a second about the different options I can dial up or dial down.
Yep.
And I can do it for China, I
Yep.
can do it America, I can do it for France or the EU. I mean, talk a little bit how it works.
So actually, we've only done it for China and the US so
Okay.
far because
Okay.
the amount of data is immense. It's a big job. So people love the idea of a price on carbon. You should pay for externalities, pollution shouldn't be free. And indeed, it's a brilliant idea. It's not, however, magic. There are some sectors that don't respond well to a price on carbon. The building sector is a great example. The people who design and build buildings never pay the utility bill. Some utilities are responsive to a price on carbon because they're competitive. Others pass through as a tax. So you need to know the difference.
Interesting.
So we found the following. We also wrote scripts to run this model tens of thousands of times to test different policy packages because policies interact. They don't add up. And we discovered the following in America, that meeting the president's clean power plan it takes about 5 steps and is incredibly cheap. And in fact, it's going to happen even in the states that most resist it because of secular trends in energy efficiency, renewable energy, and natural gas.
How do I find the model?
Sorry?
Where do I go to find the
Oh,
model?
go to energypolicy.solutions. There's these new web addresses that save you the weird 2-letter suffixes.
Perfect. Andy, one of the things I mentioned this yesterday after my different chance to interview different executives here. 2-word phrase I've been hearing here all over the place: stranded assets. And we've got a lot of energy companies here, and the question I have for you and for Hal is oil the new coal? We already know that there's going to be a lot of coal stranded. We already see that happening. Is oil the next stranded asset? And what do you think the implications of that will be?
I'm going to take that on. I also want to comment on
Please, yeah.
Hal's response and on his model, because I was the architect of some of that policy that's still in place today. The revisions to CAFE, the incandescent lighting phase out, the LED standards, et cetera. If we had then or now the power of the tools of high-performance computing, data, predictive analytics, what Hal has put in place, to use as policymakers, we would have been that much more precise in acceleration of relevant and available technology development. And what I mean by that, you know that in my world today is orthogonal between applied materials and chips and Tony Fadell and Nest and the Internet of Things and Google X, et cetera, right? So we do this for our home.
And Lorraine Powell's foundation, too.
And the Emerson Collective,
Yes,
where
yeah.
we're doing enormous work on social impact. We do this in our home. We avail these technologies right now to measure and manage ourselves, to monitor our use, to improve ourselves and get better, and it is becoming ubiquitous. We don't do this in the policy environment, and that's what Hal is offering for the first time. And why it's important, we have national laboratories, many of which that I'm associated with, have peer-reviewed this and offer it as a trusted, objective source for policymakers to catch up and to lead and not lag in ways that can offer policy solutions that are agile with the inputs and can measure with precision the outputs for societal good, be they greenhouse gas reductions or new job creation, et cetera. And so we need in Washington to get beyond the primitive in order to avail the actual life of technology cycles and evolution so that we can be an accelerant and not an impediment. So thank you, Hal, that's what you're bringing us. To your question, Tom, on oil. Stranded assets. The old economy, new economy, how fast do things depreciate? You know, when my first computer I got as a gift from my dad, a Timex Sinclair, and then a Commodore VIC-20, and then an Apple IIe, if you guys remember the cycle, I thought, I'm going to have these computers for life. And my children make fun of me to this day because I still have my first Macintosh without a hard drive. And I explained, all that you needed was on this blue little hard disk and everything else, but I'm keeping this because it's important. It was so valuable to me. Of course, it depreciated a long time ago. But in our world back then, we held those assets for a long time because we had no idea that next year's iPhone would replace this year's iPhone, right? And we're in a different speed of transition cycle the very same way with energy. You know, the utilization of the tools that are available to us now and the net benefit they bring, not just through externalities, but through paying themselves back with immediacy, like a Nest thermostat, means we're not going to hang on to the conventional model as long as we can. Utilities haven't quite got the memo yet, and a lot of that is because of their regulated parastatal or monopolistic positions, basically making them a cash machine saying, well, I paid down that boiler a long time ago, and the consumers pay for the cold briquettes, so if you'll just give me a little bit, I'll get to belong to the country club this year. I mean, that model is going to break because we live in an era where I can order my Nest by Amazon.com, go to Home Depot and get my solar panels, become completely insulated in 24 hours with a call to any number of vendors. So the consumer user experience is rendering obsolete and making those assets stranded. I'm going to let Hal play with the oil question because I've talked a bit.
Perfect. Yeah, the same thing.
Tom, we have perfect carbon sequestration already. Stores massive amounts of carbon. It's free. It works for millions of years and we can prove it. And it's called coal. Right? Coal is right where it needs to be. Right. The only problem with coal is it's got a few hydrogen atoms floating around that we kind of want. We want to liberate. Turns out that's going to be the same case with oil. Much of oil, not all of oil. Oil is a much more valuable fuel for many reasons than coal. And oil is less fungible because our transportation system is 97% oil dependent. So this is a tougher transition, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. That said, the crush on oil prices is a demand-driven trend, and that's what's important. It's been driven by fuel efficiency, but think of the new forces that are coming online. There's a topic that I call car control. The major cities of the world understand you cannot saturate the streets with cars and have a decent city. They're emphasizing transit and bus rapid transit and car shares and bikes and walking. And China is moving down that road. China has 1 car per 10 people, and they have the biggest traffic jams in the world. Do the math. You can't win with more cars. So car subtraction is a new trend. So add that in there. Put in car sharing and autonomous cars that can be super fuel efficient. Yeah. We're going to kill the price of oil and the value, and it'll begin with the expensive, dirty oils like tar sands and certain kinds of fracking oils and so on, not because of supply constraints. That's not what peaks it. It's demand. The era of infinite demand is over. We're going down.
Is OPEC dead man walking?
OPEC is dead, period.
Yes. Why do you say
They're
not even walking anymore.
Yeah, no. Right. I mean, I think you can, when I was dealing with geopolitics at the Kennedy School, there were 100 different ways to parse why the wrapper, the ribbon, the label of OPEC was important to keep in place, despite the fact that the functionality and leverage of it had been completely eroded to zero. So we know that Saudi, as a swing producer, has the capacity to move whatever it wants, when it wants, in an OPEC context, and then determine and debate and fight with others about where that should be. But OPEC as a force for holding leverage over the United States and much of the West, that capacity exists no longer. We have ample resource as far as the eye can see, and in fact we have a glut. We have an enormous glut that has the oil companies very worried about where the bottom is in terms of pricing. And they don't even begin to understand the trend you're talking about. So they are dealing with supply and the paradigm that they have lived traditionally in a world of inelastic demand for gasoline with regular predictable growth rates and cycles. Consult the EIA wedge and then vary a little bit. Today, the stochastic modeling that is necessary, I heard you talk with Carlos about our ride in the autonomous vehicle at Google last night. We don't know how fast that trend takes, but we know it is inevitable. Yeah. We know that this is going to occur, and it's going to occur on a slope, and the fuel suppliers don't quite understand what the net impact will be, and the models built around that. How will Uber converge with driverless? Will it be trains of buses with no congestion down fast HOV lanes? Will it be young people who don't desire to buy cars for themselves anymore because every one of them has a limo chauffeur? It'll probably be variants of all of these things, and that's what I think you're talking about with respect to demand.
Hal, there's a term I heard you use recently that I think is relevant and a good segue from Andy's point, accidental compliance. What is accidental compliance?
The United States EPA has ruled that we have to cut carbon emissions from the utility sector by about a third by 2025 or 2030. And this has caused some furor in about half the states. So the attorneys general of slightly more than half the states are now suing the federal government, saying the Clean Air Act shouldn't let you control our right to pollute. That's what they're saying. The Supreme Court, by the way, has already affirmed that the Clean Air Act requires the EPA to do this, but whatever. So they're politically against this idea, but in the meantime, people's houses are more efficient, their appliances are more efficient, renewable energy is incredibly cheap, natural gas is displacing coal. You add up these factors, and it turns out you don't want those coal plants very much. They spew mercury. They were built when Eisenhower was president, for goodness sakes. Talk about obsolete capital equipment. And so lots of states that hate the idea of the Clean Power Plan are going to comply with the Clean Power Plan. It's called accidental compliance, and it's a great term. It's because these are secular trends, and they're very powerful. And you can pretend they're not there, and you can try to resist them, but you do so at your own peril as a national leader or a state leader.
Fascinating.
Sorry, I was going to say coal is suffering in the U.S. to be sure, but in the context of Paris and the greater discussions here, I think we have to be mindful that coal is not going anywhere fast in China and in particularly in India, right? And therefore, we cannot give up on the research, development, technology, and deployment that is ultimately needed to capture and remove and separate these waste streams, harmful waste streams, and move them into value streams. Not unlike Kyoto itself, we've been dealing with this globally with policy by placebo. If we dig big enough holes in the ground for long enough, at least for multi-billion-dollar demonstration projects, we can pretend there's an over-horizon solution. We've got to be better about applying material science solutions to figuring out ways to deal with the brand new built coal-fired power plants that were going up at one a week across China, and the real problem that we have for energy access in India that they're talking about here at this conference.
So Andy, it's a good segue to what I wanted to follow up with, because you sit at the nexus of applied materials, Google X, and Nest. Give the folks here a little sense of what is coming down the road, what's over the horizon, and what is the public policy framework we need to scale those technologies?
Oh, good, it's a soft one. It's an easy question. Well, so I can start with the cop-out going, everything's confidential. Right. You know, what's coming down the road, as I alluded to earlier, is what you're seeing already in your homes and your offices. We started, you know, I've been in renewable energy for quite a long time, but mainly on the infrastructure side. And when people began to working on devices and the revolution around devices, they started with top-down government mandates for smart grid. We're going to do smart grid, so we're going to enable the inefficient parastatal or monopoly utility player to manage your home in a smarter way than you do. Was the thing. And so even in the most dynamic environment, San Francisco, PG&E, there was massive rejection of I don't want George Orwell as a companion at night, okay? And
Suggesting my air conditioner.
So what happened with Tony Fadell is, Tony, for those of you who don't know him, was the innovator behind the design of the iPod and iPhone. He looked at the thing on his wall and said, you know, gosh, that could be a little friendlier than having a relationship of saying, I hate you, I'm uncomfortable, how do I work you, which is our historic relationship with the thermostat. And he said, why don't I just make it look like an iPhone or an iPod? In fact, why don't I just control it from a different place? In fact, why don't I just give you the option to control it or have algorithms working in the background so it learns your behavior and controls itself for your comfort and convenience, and it's completely cost effective. And by the way, you can get it on Amazon.com and have it delivered tomorrow. And by the way, somebody can install it if it's too complicated. So all of a sudden, the consumer was direct to his energy devices and uses, okay? And that paradigm is proliferating with the Internet of Things. There is not a single device that generates or saves or stores energy that we're not going to explore. Every single device in our life is going to be Wi-Fi connected, IP addressable, and ultimately offer some energy net benefit, whether it's storing it or producing it or saving it. And so that's where the future is. In terms of displacing sort of the big base load suppliers, it's going to be how do you complement that user-driven ecosystem of comfort, cost, and convenience. And so they're going to have to do it that are in attribute-driven ways that make its way through Hal's model and show that they are clean and affordable and sustainable and what people want to support in the commons.
And Hal, what excites you about what's coming down the highway? You're also in this world.
We've been looking at studies of learning curves of different technologies. There's a fantastic new report put out of Oxford on this. Nothing in the energy world has had as steep a learning curve as solar in recent years. We've heard about 80% price drops in the last 5 years. Wind is down by almost half. Batteries are on a nice trajectory, light-emitting diodes we've heard about. Put it together and you get a whole new tranche of improvements called system optimization. And there's companies that are building their entire future on this, like General Electric. It all becomes very interesting when you look at the electric utility, and you say, what's it take to completely decarbonize the utility? We know we can get to 30%. We know we can get to 40%. New York State, California are now committed to 50% renewables by 2030, and that's not counting their nuclear and their hydro. So California will be 70% decarbonized by 2030. It's pretty amazing.
Amazing, absolutely.
However, you have to rethink the utility model altogether when you get past certain numbers, because you now have the opportunity and the obligation to optimize supply and demand against each other, to buy or borrow from other territories, to think about certain technologies that you deploy for power rather than energy. In other words, you turn them on for short amounts of time and then you let them go off. They have very little carbon footprint, even if they're fossil, like a natural gas power plant. The point is, if you optimize across all these channels, the zero carbon future costs the same as the high carbon future, or costs less. Now, I could not have said that in the Copenhagen days, right? It was a narrative of sacrifice. That said, it gets back to, let me just say one point about policy.
No, I just want to emphasize, we've shifted from a narrative of sacrifice to a narrative of opportunity.
Yes.
That's really important.
Okay, but so bad policy can cap it. Mm-hmm. And that's the scary thing. So if your utility regulations, talk about boring subject, are cost plus and give generators money to generate, and that's a 100-year history of that, it ain't going to happen. What you have to do instead, and this pertains to the previous discussion up here, is reward performance. Reward the specific attributes people care about. They care about reliability, affordability, and clean, and that's it. And so utilities should be service machines, well rewarded for delivering those attributes and punished when they fail, and no more line-by-line oversight and no more goodies for gold plating coal-fired power plants or anything else.
Fantastic.
Tom, you picked up on an important point about the sacrificing. You know, that office that I used to manage, energy efficiency and renewable energy, was earlier named the Office of Conservation.
At the
and
Department of
Renewable
Energy.
At the Department of Energy. And you and I do a lot of conservation for nature. I want to distinguish that. But I got there and I saw that title, conservation. And I said, no, conservation is using less and having less. I like conservation. I teach it to my children. My dad taught it to me. The kids in Korea, where I just came back from the war, don't have peas. Eat your peas, right? That was conservation. Jimmy Carter, wear a sweater, you'll be okay. Turn down the thermostat, you'll be fine, right? But efficiency is using less and having more. Okay, it is a new era of unleashing far greater productivity at an accelerated basis that these devices are giving us. So energy productivity is the new era based on new technologies that are harnessing stranded assets of what had been idled energy and replacing them with stranded assets which had been old conversion technology for old fuels. Okay, and that's what it means, I think, to move from sacrifice to opportunity.
We have time for one question, one quick question. I can't let these guys off without giving some. Please, sir.
That was you.
That was you. You go ahead. Well, I'll repeat your question. All right.
Lawrence Jones, excellent presentation. Andy and for Hal. One of the things that we talked about, which I know is a big topic, is cybersecurity. And when you talk about the Internet of Things, cybersecurity pops up. You guys comment a little bit on cybersecurity as we look into the future. Thank you.
Could that be one of the things that slows us down, Hal? And both of you take a crack at that.
So it's something I work on a lot and worry about a lot. But it is not something that should sandbag the ultimate movement of technology, because we are living in an era of a permanent race. So the people who would tell you cybersecurity exists, you should fear this or that, and therefore not go there, have already sort of lost the plot that our ATM machines are completely dependent on it. So if you want a cybersecurity threat, close down the ATMs for 72 hours and see how people freak out. Okay, so we need to continuously develop, innovate, and have technology, and we need to continuously recruit the best minds on our side, on the good side of the combat for applying that technology. But the dark forces aren't going away. We just have to be continuous and vigilant in a race to beat them, and not let them have us shrink from the exercise of applying technology that is better for society.
Hal, finish on that and any other summary points you want to make, and remind us what is the address of your
Thanks, Tom.
dashboard.
Thank you, Tom. Well, so just a word on this.
Please, yeah.
So the electric grid is a vulnerable and vital piece of apparatus in America. The University of California, San Diego has learned how to isolate its grid. They've created a microgrid with fantastic amounts of renewables. Fuel cells run by methane from the garbage dump, solar on every single building. But they can instantly disconnect if there's a problem on the system and run themselves. So this combination of hooked-in microgrids that are islandable is a fantastic innovation in that respect. Innovation can help. It doesn't just create more vulnerabilities. It has to be done well.
And your dashboard's address is?
Yes. Go to energypolicy.solutions and check it out. It's a fantastic learning experience. I guarantee you one thing, that your prejudices, whatever they are, will not be met.
Andy, close it out for us.
I think it's. I'd like to close on the note of Paris and why we're here, why we've gathered so many high-level thinkers. Because there's a lot of talk about, well, it's kind of a nothing burger, or it isn't as significant. It's certainly not Kyoto and the top-down thing, but it is something. Just because we can't have everything doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. Right? And this is an opportunity to do something great, to close out a quarter of a century of debate and dialogue about a framework that unites the planet in a concerted mission and gives us clarity and a system of collaboration and confidence in at least the minimum catalyst and signal we need to get started on the plans that we can update and enforce or design or apply new technology against. And that's what happens here this week. And so I'm very hopeful, and I believe we will come to a conclusion and a positive accord.
Now you understand why I love doing jazz with these guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.
Nice job.